This chap needs his new Gorilla Glue Clear. Being Gorilla Glue, it's both strong and tough. Only this one is also foam-free. And as the name suggests, crystal clear, making it perfect for bonding ceramic.
In the last few years of his life, George Michael had withdrawn from public view.
George became a recluse. He was spending most of his daylight hours behind drawn curtains, on the sofa, watching videos around the clock.
Certainly, his days as a public figure, even as a pop culture icon, seemed to be over. Whether that was conscious, or whether he desired that, or whether it was just a byproduct of the way he felt. I mean, it could have been either one. Certainly, he felt the need to withdraw. That's clear.
These feelings of isolation first surfaced decades before, as he split from Wham, leaving behind his best friend, Andrew Ridgeley.
George entered a different way of life without having all of this pally companionship. And he goes from being part of fraternity to being a person. It's part of the loneliness of graduating from school. You can never go back. And that's what George had to come to terms with.
Despite his loss, George's solo career was taking off. His masterstroke was this music video. With highly sexualized imagery and lyrics, it was guaranteed acres of press.
He knew it had a commercial hook, he knew it was going to do well. It was just a good, fun song about sex.
George has created a sensation in the pop world by pushing his sex symbol image to the limit. Some would say, well, beyond the limit.
He comes out with this very sexualized image. And so to bring out a record called I Want Your Sex was guaranteed to make waves.
Adding to the tabloid frenzy, George's then girlfriend appeared with him.
Kathy Young, the model who appears in the I Want Your Sex video, was that a relationship or was she a so-called beard?
It's not that I had stopped having sex with women, but I was already fully aware that in itself was a lie. So there was all that feeling fraudulent as well.
Leading a double life was increasingly painful for George.
If you were perceived to be concealing a true identity, this was not allowed to be your private life. You were going to be pursued by journalists and photographers until they exposed you.
George, are you gay?
Am I gay? It's a pretty direct first question, isn't it? I've never said no, I've never said yes. No, I'm not. But the main thing I like to express is that I don't think it's anybody's business.
Even before we began our chat, George spent almost an hour on makeup and hair. Image is so important to him, he'd only let us film the left side of his face. Filming your best side, like we're doing.
Absolutely.
Is that part of George Michael's performance?
Well, George Michael, the performer, picks his photos, knows his best side. George Michael, the performer, has been watching every little detail of the last 5 years very carefully.
There's a version of George Michael that's put out to the world, but I don't think that's the real George Michael. You know, he has the whole world looking at him, but he's kind of behind the dark glasses, got the leather jacket on. He's like hiding himself.
George continued to conceal himself behind his heterosexual heartthrob image. This song and this music video cemented him as a pop icon.
The demand for him was so gargantuan. And then there was also this image that he created that wasn't necessarily him, but an idea of him that he was projecting, a sort of fancy idea of this hyper macho pop star.
From the jeans to the jacket to the shirts that he wore to the beard to the hair being bleached perfectly. George was the consummate director of his career.
And with his sultry voice and unique soul sound, he was the perfect pop package for the MTV video generation.
We had 5 #1 hit singles: Faith, Father Figure, One More Try, Monkey, Kissing a Fool, and I Want Your Sex. So this was the biggest album of 1987-88.
In February 1988, George started his first solo world tour. It would take a year and a half and take him 21 countries.
I think anyone can ask me just about anything else. But any questions that I think invade my privacy will be studiously ignored.
On stage, his troubles disappeared. This footage shows how he came alive for those 2 hours, with a crowd boosting his burgeoning ego.
I'm not going to sit and think, well, they wouldn't fancy me if I wasn't a pop star, if I wasn't a singer, if I wasn't rich, because I am all those things, and that's part of what attracts people to me now.
At 23, George was a millionaire.
But I didn't want to be rich. Live in a big house, have a flashy car. I just wanted to be filthily famous.
His sudden wealth created another inner struggle.
This was a core conflict that really he never resolved. On the one hand, he's got this incredible success and wealth, but that's not what he's grown up with, and it's not in his core values. He was deeply uncomfortable with it and didn't enhance the quality of his life at all, really.
Life at the top had become a poisoned chalice.
You're having a concert with 20,000 screaming fans, and then you leave and you're alone and you're isolated. And if you're in fact gay and in the closet, that's a torturous spot to be in, night after night after night. Not having companionship, not having the ability to be yourself, and being alone and trying to have this image of being someone else that you're not, which was a sex symbol for all the screaming girls that were in the audience.
That's the recurring theme of his life, that George hasn't got anyone around him who can turn what's become a kind of secret life into a more open and honest life.
I suppose I was prone to loneliness, because it is very lonely if you're surrounded by people, but you're not really surrounded by anyone.
Who are you?
Andrew. Richard. Yes, I know him.
A visit from his best friend was George's only respite from the grueling tour.
He probably needed his old mate, Andrew, to come back to him, to make him back up, and to remind him, George, this is what you wanted, mate.
How's life in the penitentiary?
It's good to see you, man.
It's been different.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
I heard you've been spending every night in your dressing room. Well, that ain't right here right now.
Andrew.
Oh, yeah?
Being watched by the press and management made George increasingly uneasy.
Come on. Lightweight. Come on.
You don't know what it's like. There's eyes everywhere.
Come on.
Mate, honestly, I can't.
I know.
But the fleeting visit of a friend who knew him so intimately only reinforced his solitude.
I know. You know I know. And I know that you know that I know.
And
And I know that you
Hey, let's go for it, but one drink, okay?
It was always clear, once he'd attained that level of superstardom, how standoffishly and how roughly the security treated closest friends.
Hey, George, hey, what's happening? You going out? My friend from London's just... Oh, that's nice. Andrew, I think you should get some rest.
Do you?
Must have been a long flight. You've got 3 weeks of gigs, remember? Sure. No problem.
When you yourself become an economic unit, then you come under tremendous pressures from people whose business is just business. And this is not fun.
As the tour went on and he was actually face to face with the crowd, he realised what the expectations of him would be to keep selling that particular image and that idea of himself. I think he became more and more depressed.
Soaps and Coke? I loved making the music, but actually the whole kind of circus of it was very distressing for me.
You're one of the highest selling artists in the world, mate. And you've got a face like a wet weekend. This fits it. Come on. The night is young. Lighten up.
He's not with the mere mortals anymore. And it's kind of an irony that, you know, he should start sinking into, not despair, I'm sure, but a form of loneliness and unhappiness.
Hey.
The press are watching you and hounding you. You've been pushed by your manager and your Greco company to have to do this interview. Sting, you come off stage tired, or you feel depressed because you've just lost this enormous audience love.
I know I should be happy, I know, but with everything. But...
You did the right thing, York. Sooner or later, you had to go out alone.
He hasn't got somebody there with him who cares. He hasn't got a brotherly type partner like he had with Andrew, and he can't even find somebody to have sex with because he's secretive about it. So you just become horrifically lonely and introverted.
George and I were once having a discussion, and he did say there comes a point when having everything is not enough. And you begin to think, there must be more to life than this. When everything that is being handed to you on a plate just isn't doing it for you anymore.
You're in your early 20s, you've sold nearly 40 million records, you're set financially. What are the things you'd really like to accomplish in the next 2 or 3 years in your career?
Obviously, I'd like to remain a happy person, someone that's happy with themselves.
But despite achieving his wildest dreams, the void George felt would only get worse.
He gets into a very uncomfortable situation, which he could not have foreseen.
You know about this guy?
He's a convicted hacker serving 15 years.
As an older man, George Michael was openly gay. Going to a park in North London for sex became a ritual.
I think after George came out publicly, he was almost evangelical about telling the truth. He wasn't about to be silenced or shamed. He was going to be completely honest about every aspect of his life and about his sex life. He was quite open about talking about the fact that he had gone cruising. I asked George about cruising. I asked if it was like a secret place for him, and I think it was somewhere where, and I think in a way it was something he had control over and could be free to, you know, feed his voracious sexual appetite and meet real people on a level, not be the superstar that everyone's chasing for an autograph.
Sex with multiple strangers when you're famous was seen as reckless behaviour by the press. But for George, his lifestyle brought freedom and happiness.
I'm a very, very lucky man. My career is still a great joy to me, despite the media. I'm healthy and happy and living my life.
George hadn't always felt free. His desire to lead a more honest life was born after the claustrophobia of the Faith Tour in 1988.
It gets to that point where he looks at it and goes, I don't think I want this anymore. And he starts to actively back away from the idea of becoming the megastar that he himself has created.
The carefully curated heterosexual heartthrob persona had become a noose around his neck.
He was remarkably honest and true to himself and not wanting to perpetuate a lie about himself to the world.
I freaked out. I said, I don't want to make any more videos. I don't think I'll ever tour again. I have to step back. That was the turning point for me. I had to negotiate some new relationship with celebrity that wasn't going to destroy me.
George took 2 years out. He reassessed his life, radically changed his look, and he made a critical decision, refusing to promote or appear in his music videos on a new...
What time is it in New York? Around lunchtime.
George and his manager phoned the record company to break the news.
Hi there. So, we're keen to figure out how things will sit in terms of any new direction.
He was a cash cow for the label. He was one of their biggest artists, if not their biggest artist at the point, I'm sure. And he refused to play the game.
George, it's hard to see how we can promote this without your image. Folks, they want to see the whole package.
And that created a huge rift.
Okay, we'll have a talk between us, and we'll get back to you.
Great. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Talk to you soon. That asshole doesn't get in the next...
Might have a multi-platinum album, Listen Without Prejudice, but George needed more from life. He wanted to find love. Whilst performing in Brazil, he spotted a young man in the crowd. They met later that night.
I don't know if people relate to this, but there have only been 3 times in my life that I've really fallen for anyone. Each time, on first sight, something has clicked in my head that told me I was going to know that person.
He was Brazilian fashion designer Anselmo Filipa.
And what happened was he actually met Anselmo, his first big, proper adult relationship.
You know, I saw you at my concert. You're cute.
Something brilliant and wonderful had happened to him.
At the ripe age of 27, George decided this was it. This was the real thing. This was the one.
For 6 months, I was happier than I'd ever been in my entire life. Fame, money, all the things, you know, everything else just kind of paled by comparison to finally, at 27 years old, waking up in bed with someone who loves you, you know.
Anselmo moved to Los Angeles to live with George. And at first, they were like any other couple in love.
Thank you. Something wrong? Tell me. You know, you don't look well.
What's up? You can tell me.
They said if I wasn't feeling better yet, that I should, have a test.
What kind of test?
The test.
It's soft.
Anselmo went back to Brazil to be tested for HIV. George was left alone, waiting to hear whether the love of his life had the disease.
Don't you do this to me.
I went home to my family for Christmas, not knowing whether this man I was in love with was terminally ill, and therefore not knowing whether I potentially was terminally ill. And you're sitting there at Christmas. It was possibly the loneliest time in my life, I think.
I've got these huge problems. I don't know what to do about them, and I can't talk about it. I can't talk about it to any of you.
Eat up, Julius.
I'm fine.
Try to understand how much I love my family, and that AIDS was the predominant feature of being gay in the 80s and early 90s. For my mother, every single day would have been a nightmare for her, thinking about what I might be subjected to. AIDS was just not something I was prepared to bring into my parents' life.
Jack! Jack!
There was another reason George didn't confide in his mother.
She had had a homosexual brother who tragically committed suicide, and also her father had taken his own life.
Hello? Yes, ambulance, please.
And he would have thought, I can't be the bearer of these bad tidings of my own to my mother when she's already been through that.
What's the matter, Julius? You look like you're at a funeral.
I've just got a lot on my plate at the moment.
I think the pressure that must have been bearing down on him must have been considerable.
Just 6 months after falling in love, George's worst fears were confirmed. Anselmo did have HIV.
It is a cruel trick for life to play. The new love of his life is poisoned with sadness. It would have hit him like a steam train.
Only a few months earlier, George's friend Freddie Mercury had died of AIDS. George joined a host of stars to pay tribute at a televised concert. With an audience of 1 billion, he put on a brave face.
Baby, you didn't have to come backstage.
I didn't want to upset you. I just wanted to wish you good luck.
George was in the media spotlight with the whole world looking at him, wanted to give the performance of his lifetime. In a way, he was singing for Anselmo, I guess.
1 minute, George.
Gonna make Freddie proud.
You can't have grief if you're so much in the public eye.
None of us knew of his heartache at that point. None of us knew that his lover was going to die. None of us knew that.
George Michael joined the surviving members of Queen on stage at Wembley Stadium to pay tribute to the late, great Freddie Mercury.
George Michael stole the Freddie Mercury tribute concert from under the noses of all the other artists that day. He was phenomenal. He sang Freddie's mother's favourite song. It sent shivers down his spine. And no one could have known the grief, the agony that he was going through privately.
I
had to do two things. I had to honour Freddie Mercury, and I had to pray for Anselmo. So it was so much to me, all in that one performance. I'm so proud of the fact that I held on to that feeling because I just wanted to die inside.
His vulnerability was the thing that left him weak. That was his Achilles heel.
With his lover terminally ill and not being able to talk to his family, George would be alone once more.
Who did he have guiding him? Who did he have to go to? No one, really. This stands to reason he went off the rails.
George Michael's colourful private life ensured journalists followed his every move. In 2006, a newspaper trailed him into a park where he'd gone cruising for sex. George was by now openly gay, but it was the last straw.
I'm here again in response to some pretty extreme behaviour by the press media. I have lived with photographers outside my house and following me around 24 hours a day for nearly 6 months.
Because you're George Michael.
No, there's a story. Yes, but no, I don't accept that there is a story because someone is allowed to follow me at 2:30 in the morning. It's vile that anyone, let alone an individual, should be consistently pilloried for what they do in their private life.
George's anger was born decades earlier in how gay men were treated during the AIDS crisis.
He would have been scared. It was fear that kept him in there, kept him in the club.
George was also nursing his partner, Anselmo, who was HIV positive.
George, I'm going to Brazil. The standards there is so much better.
You know it's not that fucking insane. I won't take no for an answer.
Amor, if you only knew what it was like in Brazil.
You get the treatment done here in the US, or in London if you want. They're the only places where there's a chance it'll work.
He felt that Anselmo himself hadn't thought the best treatment he could possibly get.
But I don't give a shit if the press find out. They're scum. They're fucking scum.
Anselmo, he didn't want the LA media to be following him and therefore implicate George into this and it becoming a huge media tabloid frenzy around George's gay lover is dying of AIDS.
But I just want you to live. I can't live without you, baby.
Anselmo left for treatment, with George forced to stay in Los Angeles.
I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. At that point in time, I had no idea what to do. It was such a dark period of my life, and I thought it was just going to continue that way.
Depression was a fact of George's life. There's really no one there to help him. And I think that's his tragedy.
In March 1993, he heard news from Brazil. Anselmo had died suddenly from a brain hemorrhage. George hadn't been able to be with him.
People dying makes you angry. It's a very strange thing. It doesn't make you sad, it makes you extremely angry.
I was terrified. Angry about my beautiful boy being taken from me, there was the part of my personality that could say, okay, fuck this. This can't all be bad. I've got to do something good with this time in my life. And that's what I tried to do.
George finally told his family the truth, and that he'd lost the love of his life.
When I came out to my mother, I wrote her a letter the day after Anselmo died, because it seemed absolutely simple. If there was a message at the moment of his death, it was, well, this is when you tell your parents, because this is the only part of yourself that you haven't opened up. I was dealing with the fact that the person I cared for most in the world had died. It was very obvious that I was going through something personal that meant I couldn't face the world.
George hadn't released new music since Listen Without Prejudice, and his relationship with his record company was breaking down.
When you just made $200 million for a company, you expect them to have a little bit of patience with you, you know?
An angry George brought in lawyers to free himself from what he saw as an unfair contract, as well as helping struggling artists do the same.
He was coming through the tragedy with Anselmo. He needed a project. He needed something to focus on. And that became it. It became all-consuming. I feel in that sense it was a palliative for the emotional pain that he was feeling.
Sony refused to release him, and George took them to court in a highly publicised trial.
I have no right to resign. In fact, there is no such thing as resignation for an artist in the music industry. Professional slavery.
That rift developed into this extended court case, which lasted for the best part of 2 years, which effectively derailed his career and stopped him from making any new music.
George lost the case, and over £3 million.
George was somebody who was so adamant to have control of his career, and he fought Sony, and he fought the media, and he wanted to retain that, but yet he does something which could be perceived as really reckless and kind of the complete opposite of that.
The music business itself is a very destructive business, but the music business by its nature is feeding off and bringing into its aura already self-destructive people, because artists are self-destructive people.
The battle with Sony was but the start of self-destructive behaviour brought on by Anselmo's death. For 2 more years, George hid from the world, smoking 24 cannabis joints a day.
George became a stoner. He said it. That's his word. It's not mine.
If you're a superstar, you are grieving in public. You can't just be yourself. The tendency then is to contain grief and to swallow it, to hold it in, and it will do damage. It will eat away at you and corrode you from the inside out. And you're looking for ways to alleviate the pain that that's causing. And why wouldn't you take the drugs?
The way he was self-medicating, it may have made him actually psychologically more vulnerable.
He was in a dearth of creativity. Music wasn't coming easily to him. Songwriting wasn't coming easily to him.
I didn't know when I would ever be happy enough to write another song. This man's life was much more important to me than entertaining people. I never want to feel that loss. I'd never want to feel that depth of emotion again.
George increasingly relied on his mother, Leslie.
You can't go on like this.
I know, Mum. I just can't seem to make it go away.
Maybe you're looking in the wrong direction.
My experience of working with George Michael was that the creative process for him was an extremely painful one.
It was only in 1996 that George felt able to release music again. It was a tribute to Anselmo.
He wanted to share what was on his mind and in his heart at that time. Unfortunately, it was heartbreak, so we got heartbreak.
The video too was somber, showing a grief-stricken and older George, a world away from his sex symbol image.
It is a fantastic, emotional song, that deals with all the subtext of George's life, love, faith, all these things that are there.
And there's lines like heaven sent and heaven stole, this pained vocal, there's no ambiguity there.
In his despair, music was his salvation. The song topped the charts, and George secretly gave his profits to charity. He also donated to AIDS organizations in Anselmo's memory.
George gave $50,000 on the condition that he not be named. Beautiful gesture.
But despite his success, George increasingly shut himself away.
But I do think his way of dealing with the symptoms of grief, to get totally stoned all the time, his life was going down a particular trajectory.
This stuff keeps me sane and happy. I could write without it if I was sane and happy.
In the last 10 years of his life, George Michael was to become known more for his drug use than his music.
What we have here is a trajectory whereby the middle-aged man is much more of a hedonist. What the younger man indulged in, what was an indulgence, becomes a compulsion. But we all know it's diminishing returns.
1996, 3 years after Anselmo died, George found love again with Kenny Goss, a Texan businessman.
I think Kenny was very helpful in showing him that he could love again, that the death of Anselmo was not the end of the world. This planet keeps spinning.
I'm loving this new flavour.
Go on. Have you phoned your mum yet?
No, I was going to do it now.
Kelly, he was a really nice guy. They loved each other very much. This is a very strong relationship.
Hey, Mum. How are you? Good. So anyway, what is it you wanted to tell me? Oh my God.
What?
He found a new love who seems to have stabilised him for a lot of years. When he's telling his mother about the new man in his life, she's telling him that the mole, the melanoma she's had looked at, has actually turned out to be malignant.
She's got cancer.
Part of the great sadness of his life is that love and loss seem to be intertwined.
George Michael's mother was a massive influence on him. You know, I think she embodied many of the values that he had all his life. Kindness, generosity, understanding, patience.
George again disappears from public view to nurse his mother.
Throughout the time that Leslie is battling this illness, you know, there are tabloid journalists posing as doctors coming in to try and get a photograph of him or his mother. It's the worst violation. There's no excuse for that kind of level of intrusion. And this is the reality of what George is having to deal with.
In February 1997, just a few months after her diagnosis, Leslie Arnold Panayotou succumbed to cancer.
It happened very quickly. Nobody was really aware of how ill she was.
That very week, George recorded a song in her memory, a duet with his friend Toby Burke.
I was standing next to someone who was in intense grief and intense isolation.
And I think that was a real pivotal moment for him, a thing that changed him and where his life was going completely.
He's increasingly isolated, and I think it is the beginning of a long and slow decline, personally and emotionally. He's in a sad, lonely world. I don't think the grief ever left him.
The depression's been in the family, and I'm susceptible to it. And I took bereavement, I think I took it particularly badly. I didn't know if I would recover from it in some ways. I know I have a very self-destructive tendency. Since my mother died, I've got to be honest, that's kind of made itself clear in other ways.
Georgie's increasingly self-destructive impulses emerged very publicly the year after his mother's death.
On April 7, 1998, at approximately 16:48 hours, Beverly Hills police officers arrested the singer known as George Michael. Members of our crime suppression unit did observe Mr. Michael's engaged in a lewd act.
Michael didn't stop his lewd behavior even though he knew he was being observed.
There was a defiance about it. Now there were no restrictions. After his mother died, there was nothing left to lose.
I always knew it was going to happen sometime. I was going to get outed one way or another, but it was subconsciously deliberate. I think I was sick of the secret. Now that there wasn't any reason to be quiet, now that my mother was no longer in this world, it was a kind of reckless thing to do.
Michael was released on $500 bail last night. There was no answer today at his Hillside home, but the neighborhood was under siege by an army of paparazzi.
What will it mean for his career? Well, I mean, I think that this will jeopardise his career in many ways. Just the distaste of being found in this way.
But that didn't happen. In fact, being outed as gay in such spectacular fashion made George's star shine even brighter.
The most light-hearted that I ever saw George, and was right after he came back from Los Angeles. What George needed in his life more than anything was honesty, and I think his life's changed completely.
I was signing more autographs. More people were coming up to me in the street and saying, "We love what you do and good luck to you."
It was like a weight off his shoulders. He could absolutely be himself.
Obviously, you can't come on a show like this without mention of the wanking in the toilet thing.
Which wanking in the toilet thing? Which one?
The arresting.
Oh,
the arresting.
of course.
That one. You're fantastic, sort of unapologetic about it.
Well, I mean, what's to apologise for? I'm a gay man. I'm at the time I was like 36 years old. To be perfectly honest, it was a lovely park.
With another iconic music video, George showed the world he refused to let the incident take him down.
The Outside video, he turns what could be a potentially career-destroying incident into this brilliant, tour de force of humour, and he's poking fun at himself. He's dressing up as a kind of cop, dancing in a lavatory where the urinals spin round and a mirror ball comes down and it turns into a huge party. He took total control, as he always did in his career. There was no apologies about it, there was no shame. He was just like, this is who I am, deal with it.
Outside reached number 2 in the UK charts. George's musical talent once again turned a personal low into a professional success.
Where did we just get up to? We've got to have that there in case I don't go for that live. Okay, shall we have another go? One of the reasons my life has been so extreme and has felt so, in some ways, self-destructive, is that I never had any feeling that my talent was going to let me down. My career...
Popularity.
Splashed across the tabloids again, the paparazzi are camped outside George Michael's North London home.
In 2006, George was involved in a series of driving incidents, resulting in him losing his license.
Essentially what you had was this series of almost slapstick events.
Drivers called police to say that his car was causing an obstruction at this junction in Cricklewood.
It's very easy to laugh at what happened with George and his various motor vehicle mishaps.
And when police found him asleep at the wheel and in possession of drugs, sex toys and a gimp mask, the tabloids lapped up every detail.
My manager was on the phone to me and I'd said, I want the gist of it, but I don't want any of the detail. And he said, well, they said that you were unconscious behind the wheel and that you were probably out of it, kind of thing. And I said, no. He said, yes. He said, they reckon there was a bunch of sex stuff in the car with you. I said, no. He said, yeah. I said, they printed that. He said, yeah. I said, no, God. And then he said, and they've used that fat picture of you again. I was like, get me Richard and Judy. Get me on Richard and Judy now.
It didn't really matter what disaster happened. George had turned it to his advantage. He was brilliant at it.
That same year, hundreds of thousands of fans flocked to see George in his first world tour in 15 years.
I'm a very, very lucky man. I've got a wonderful partner. My career is still a great joy to me. I'm still very happy with the music I'm making. I've still landed. So, you know, I'm enjoying my life.
George also earned praise for giving a free concert for the nurses who looked after his mother a decade before.
It's nice that someone's done something for nurses. Somebody's actually appreciated nurses.
George's career seemed indestructible.
But actually, when you've achieved everything there is to achieve, what are you going to do next? And so you're going to start pushing the envelope and being more and more reckless.
I wish you wouldn't. All I'm saying is that I don't think you should be smoking it all the time.
Kenny, he was clearly a more level-headed guy. He was what kept the stabilisers on George.
A psychiatrist told me once that, you know, because I said, what should I do? And he said, Kenny, please don't leave. I think you're the only reason he lives. I don't know. And, you know, I certainly did my best to protect him.
Something I can't handle. No one can handle that much.
But I don't think it was enough to stop the demons inside of George from getting the better of him.
Having a very addictive personality, just as George was addicted to applause and adulation from thousands of complete strangers, he became quickly very addicted to narcotics.
Soon after the tour ended in 2008, he was arrested in a public toilet and cautioned for possession of crack cocaine.
I'm sure that a lot of this was George's constant search for the next thrill and for a bigger thrill and something to really get off on, but it kind of went horribly wrong, really. He had lost control. Those habits, those evils were in charge of George.
I feel with Kenny Goss, he was probably a very tolerant soul who had seen more than he wanted to.
In 2009, Kenny and George split after 13 years together, and Kenny moved back to America.
George lost a real kind of rock of stability there when Kenny left, it seems.
He went ever deeper, ever out of control. Once somebody presses that self-destruct button, you know that the damage is done, the red button is pressed. There is no going back, to the point that you will tip over the edge.
The following year, George was arrested again after smashing his car into a shop whilst high.
Someone wrote wham on the indentation outside the Snappy Snap store. It could have been so much worse.
While no one was harmed in the crash, in court, the judge made it clear how out of control George had become.
It does not appear that you took proper steps to deal with what is clearly an addiction to cannabis.
Fans sobbed on hearing George Michael had been sentenced to 8 weeks in prison.
For George Michael, this prison sentence will deliver a short, sharp shock.
He was contrite about it. You know, he was basically a moral human being, and he would have felt quite shamed by it, I'm sure.
After leaving prison, George went into drug counselling, but made light of his incarceration.
Thank you to everybody that supported me in there. It's quite inspirational. Oh, by the way, I've just thought of a really good idea for a song. It's not going to be nothing to do with prison. Thank you.
In characteristic style, George turned the incident into positive PR, appearing with James Corden in this comedy sketch.
What you get up to in your spare time is up to you, all right?
Why can't I come to Comic Relief?
Because you're a joke, George. It's embarrassing. I can't walk into Comic Relief with you. Comic Relief's about helping people like you.
Yeah, I mean, to do Comic Relief is quite brave anyway, and to make a fool of yourself, which he obviously didn't mind at all.
Right, I'm going in. You wait here, okay? Don't go wandering around looking for trouble.
Sitting in the car, trying to go in and being told to just sit where he was.
Love this one, don't you? Can't be good.
By making fun of himself and singing an old hit, George didn't appear to be taking life too seriously.
Baby, I'm your man.
He'd gone from being this guarded control freak to being a guy who would go on TV shows and actively send up, parody his own public image. I think this almost comical trajectory ultimately was tragic.
Looking back over that period of his life when he was doing worse and worse things and getting arrested and going to prison and putting his car through a shop window and all of these things, they don't indicate a man who was trying to get better, who was trying to help himself.
I think he probably loses his ability to deal with his life in the creative way that he has done. That's the tragedy here.
And so he embarked on his Symphonica tour.
Singing with an orchestra is just, it's everything I dreamed it'd be, really. And the crowds have been absolutely fantastic.
He was playing such large places. He filled them right up, all the way. It was sold out.
People's response to you over time gets stronger. It doesn't necessarily go with your chart success or whatever. It goes with how long you've been around. It feels amazing, and I hope that I'll be a better singer than I've ever been.
I got the feeling that he was in complete control of his career. That, you know, he knew what he wanted to do. He knew how he wanted to do it. This is really going to be a huge time for George.
George also had a new lover, Fadi Fawaz, and claimed he had kicked drugs.
One of the things that was going to keep me clean was rewarding myself with music. I knew that was going to be inspirational for me. I knew that it would feed me.
But within a few weeks, the strain of performing dozens of concerts suddenly took its toll.
Every night, he's laying his heart bare for large audiences. Ugh. How draining.
I think he was exhausted. Maybe it was stress, maybe he was worried.
He went from feeling ill, from feeling feverish, from coughing. It went from seeming like a vaguely trivial ailment to being extremely life-threatening within a short space of time.
3 months into the tour, George collapsed backstage.
George had developed a form of pneumonia.
He went into a coma and spent a month in intensive care.
Looking weak but feeling better, this is the first we've seen of George Michael for over a month. Talk us through those 3 weeks. It must have been very difficult.
It was basically, by far, the worst month of my life. So I have to believe that somebody thinks I've still got some work to do here. But I have plenty to live for. I've spent the last 10 days since I woke up literally thanking people for saving my life, which is something I've never had to do before, never wanted to do again.
You say this experience has changed your life? It makes you reassess things?
Absolutely. I'm a new man.
George's pneumonia derailed the tour. Very sadly, we can see now it was a kind of dark forebear of things to come.
Cheers, everyone. Have a great Christmas.
George again seemed to make a remarkable recovery.
This is called Feeling Good.
Just a few months later, he released a single, sang at the 2012 Olympics, and finished his world tour. For a man who'd cheated death, he seemed invincible.
He appeared fit and toned. He appeared to be trying to revert to the young man who was very much in control. How much of that may have been a smokescreen, I'm not sure.
But when George fell out of a speeding car only a year later, it was a sign his demons hadn't left him.
I thought, oh boy, now what's going to happen?
In 2014, he was rushed to hospital after a mysterious collapse.
By this stage, George is in his early 50s. There's only so long you can go on in a certain way. You're not immortal. But I think we should remember that he did stay creative.
As always, this was an emotional performance. With a video as cinematic as ever. But George once again chose not to appear. The song was a cover, peaking at just 53 in the charts. It would be the last single George ever released.
Artists quite often get to the end of their career and they feel they're on a long slide down from the success they knew. And you're not likely to stop yourself from the slide. Imagine yourself in a water slide halfway down. I think I don't want us to go. No, it might be fast or slow, but you're going to go down that slide.
I think he probably loses his ability to deal with his life in the creative way that he has done.
Although he'd released the Symphonica live album in 2014, stories he was working on a new studio album came to nothing.
He'd been promising that album for several years, and we heard so little of it. The amount of time spent on music, you can only conjecture that it must be next to nothing. So this is a man who depends upon his sense of self-worth for his creativity. You know, if I don't create, if I'm not out, if I'm not performing, what am I worth? What's my value?
He wasn't driven to create to try and alleviate this despair, which suggests to me a deep depression, a clinical depression.
In a life marked by lows, losing music was George's breaking point.
How are you, Tot?
For George Michael, it must have been a lot of years since he really felt like a superstar. I think he became as vulnerable as any other human being. The fact that his physical appearance had altered so much must have been quite hard to take for him. This is a guy who for a large period of his life had been a sex symbol.
George again took solace in drugs.
Anybody that's an addicted personality, which he obviously was, it doesn't stop. I mean, you have good periods, you have bad periods.
He was very much two people at this stage. By day, he was the normal, loving, generous, wonderful George. He'd come round to your house with a carload of presents. He'd play with your kids. But then when he left that and went off by himself and was alone with himself, he would then feel the need to go back down into an underworld.
He had developed a secret life, a life that he shut people out of. You know, the result of that is this lonely, isolated man. You know, clearly with with substance issues.
Did George Michael have a death wish? I think all artists have a death wish. George did go over to the dark side. There's no question that he did. Those evils were in charge of George.
Trying to shake his demons, in 2015, George spent a year in rehab for drug addiction. But even after his release, he looked a man at his lowest ebb.
The pictures towards the end of his life indicate somebody who was not looking after himself physically or mentally. He was overweight, his face was distorted, he seemed out of control, finally, completely out of control. He was obviously broken, he was obviously given up, really, hadn't he?
He was reclusive in the final days. It's certainly clear that at that point of his life he didn't want to interact with people. The sad thing is, he was a great sentimentalist, not purely from the love lyrics of his songs, but for the fact that he loved Christmas.
But it was to be his last Christmas. On the morning of Christmas Day, 2016,
Happy Christmas!
George Michael's body was discovered by his boyfriend Fadi. He died of natural causes, heart failure and liver disease.
I've always loved him, his music, everything about him really. Just in shock.
He's an icon for the country. You know, musically, as a person, he was fantastic and we'll always remember him.
Just too young to die, so just wish he could keep going, because I would love to keep listening to his music.
George was buried next to his mother.
The thing that keeps me at peace is I know that he's with his mother. He loved her dearly, as much as any son could ever love a mother. So he's with her now.
George Michael lived his life in public, but it was only in death that the public got to know who George Michael really was.
I came on in 2010 because we'd been denied IVF. So we came on to talk about it, and then I've been home 2 days and I just got a phone call from a PA who said a businessman would like to donate some money for one cycle of IVF for you.
When you read this was
it.
the moment.
Yeah.
It says, congratulations to you both, love from George Michael, in brackets, aka Anonymous.
After a life marked by secrecy, his death revealed one final secret.
None of us knew, did we, about all his philanthropic work, for example, until after he died.
And this is the tip of the iceberg. He'd secretly donated to charity and to good causes. Over £10 million.
There is something very moving about it because it clearly is not done for any personal gain.
For 35 years, George Michael's songs had been the soundtrack to countless people's lives.
He was genius at writing songs that encapsulated the emotions, the feelings of ordinary people.
Yes, he struggled with the pressures of fame because he was such a huge star, but also he was able to turn that into the most brilliant pop music ever made.
He was a wonderful human being and a wonderful talent.
The legacy of the music, which we have forever. So we have George forever in a way.